if a pet dies, not talking about it isn't going to help the child feel better. It'll just leave them more confused and require them to grieve by themselves without the support we could provide. So I think it's important to realize that kids actually have the capacity to learn this and to be able to use that information to help them cope with loss at a much younger age than people imagine. That first concept is irreversibility. If children don't know that somebody who has died is never going to come back, or a pet that has died is never going to come back, they actually have no reason to mourn. They can just wait. And so they may actually put off mourning because they'll just wait for reunion and then be upset when that doesn't occur. Now, a lot of people will say that's very difficult for children to understand, and I want to point out it's difficult even for adults to accept when it's somebody or something close to them, such as a pet that's been a part of their life. The other is that they have to understand that when someone dies, all life functions cease completely. And that's where the comment about the television dying or car dying becomes confusing. So if you think about it, if you have a young child, say a 3 or 4-year-old, and your dog dies, and you say, well, why don't you put the dog toy in, we're going to bury the dog and we'll bury them with the dog toy. Children might assume that means the dog will still play with the toy. And if a dog can still play with the toy, that means they know they're buried alive and they're trying to get out of the ground and they're suffering. And then they'll worry that they're cold or hungry. So we want to make sure that we're clearly communicating to kids what it means when somebody or something dies so that they don't have to worry about physical suffering of the deceased. Then the third concept is inevitability. All living things eventually die, because if you don't think it's inevitable, that means that individual or that pet was chosen to die. And if they're chosen to die, it means somebody did something wrong. So either the pet was naughty and has been punished by being killed, or the child was naughty and somebody has punished them by taking away the pet they love. And that leads to a higher rate of feeling guilt or of feeling shame if you blame the person that died or the pet that died. And then the last concept is causality, understanding at a basic level, why did the pet die, so that they're less likely to assume it was something that the pet did wrong or something that the child did wrong. I generally don't use the term closure because I think what we realize is that those that we care about are always part of our life, and we don't want to close that. We want to stay connected. We call them continuing bonds. We want to figure out how to remain connected to those who are important to us in our lives, and that is part of how we honor them, is by maintaining that connection. What you want to do is some a ritual or some experience that's relevant to the child, that's of their choosing, that allows them to acknowledge what this means to them. And it can be very simple. It doesn't have to be very, involved. But you want to make sure that it's something of their choosing and something that allows them to participate actively. I think when you try and replace a pet or a person who's died too quickly, then it suggests the value of that pet or that relationship was not that important and it's replaceable. And it doesn't allow the child to continue to express their grief and to cope with it. The timing, I think, depends on when the child is ready. And you don't want to rush it. We try and cheer up people who are grieving, not because it actually cheers them up, but because we don't want to see them grieving because it's painful to watch. So we try and say things like, oh, it's going to be okay, you still have this, and they're still acutely grieving. And what we really need to do is allow them to sit with their distress and be there to help them cope with the distress, not tell them they can't express it. First off, I think you just need to acknowledge that something bad has happened. So I heard that your dog died, I'm very sorry. Just to acknowledge the loss, and also to, particularly for older children and adults, sometimes they feel that they shouldn't be grieving as much as they actually are. You form very close relationships with your pets, and it feels very similar to the death of a person. when you have that type of a long-standing and close relationship. And sometimes people don't feel they're supposed to feel that way, that somehow it's inappropriate. In the middle of the pandemic, if you talk about the fact that your pet died while people are losing spouses and parents, it may seem like you're not supposed to be grieving that much. But actually, the grief can be very strong. I always tell people, don't bring in your own loss experience. Just ask the child to share their experience and what it means to them. You might want to ask something about the pet. Can you tell me something about your dog or your cat? Or just simply, how are you doing? Sometimes even adults, actually often adults, will feel guilty after a death of a pet because in some ways it's easier to feel guilty than to realize you had no role in it. Because when something you care about dies, you worry that others will. And if you have to admit to yourself, I had no control over that happening, it means you have no control over it happening again. So sometimes people will assume guilt because it gives them the illusion of control. If I failed to feed the rat and that's why the rat died, then I just got to make sure I feed it every single day. That leads to overfeeding pets, does not increase their lifespan, actually shortens it probably, and it doesn't work. So it's not a good coping technique. So one of the things that I think is important is to tell children, I know you really took care of your rat. I know you were really careful with your rat. I know there wasn't anything you did, didn't do, or should have done that was the reason why the rat died. But a lot of times people feel that way. They feel guilty. Did you ever feel that way? You would be surprised how many people will then say, yes, I did feel guilty. And so that's something else. I always tell people, reassure children, and for that matter, adults, that their lack of responsibility after a death, even though you would think there's no logical reason why they would feel that way, there is a logical reason. I think parents try and protect their kids because they don't want to upset them. But the reality is what upsets them is the loss, not the discussion about it. Discussion is only what helps them deal with it. So yes, I think we end up not having the discussion. And it's not always easier to not have the discussion because it requires a lot of effort to hide information. It often leads to more guilt within the parent. Discuss death in a more matter-of-fact way, disconnected from personal relationships, such as you see a bird that's dead outside, then you talk about it and you explain, because kids are going to want to know, what does that mean? Why isn't it moving? And you have that conversation. You don't avoid the conversation, you talk about it. There are many of these books. And what I would suggest is look at the book. Is it honest and open in its depiction? Does it help them understand the physical reality about what's happened? And does it give an opportunity to show some of what grief is and also how to cope with the loss? And if that's covered, you'll know it's doing a good job. If we start to feel that our role is only to make children happy, then what we do is avoid helping them cope with the difficult things that they are faced with. And so I think that you can really bond with a child even deeper when you're honest and open about things that are difficult but important.